Hello again. I spoke this morning of the air crash in America when a military helicopter collided with a civil airliner. It has been suggested that this was connected in some way with the quest for diversity amongst pilots and those working for the Federal Aviation Administration. Certainly, among military pilots and ground staff, this desire to see more women, ethnic minorities, and those with disabilities has been a strong motivating force for over 30 years now and has allegedly resulted in accidents before now. On the 25th of October 1994, a woman called Cara Spills Haltgreen was killed as she attempted to land a fighter plane onto an American aircraft carrier on a routine training mission off the coast of San Diego. Holt Green had achieved fame briefly for becoming the first woman fighter pilot in the American Armed Forces. Her accomplishment was the subject of controversy, though, after her death, for it was alleged that there was a lot of political pressure on both the Air Force and Navy to produce a female pilot in order to demonstrate that there was no sexism in the armed forces. Rumours, which were later confirmed, suggested that men were overlooked for qualification so that the Navy could produce a female fighter pilot. Holt Green had failed her first test, and there were those who said that she was not of sufficiently high caliber to be a pilot landing aircraft on the decks of an aircraft carrier. There was also a suspicion that the Navy had rushed the process of allowing Holt Green to qualify because they were determined to beat the Air Force in having a female fighter pilot. How true all the stories about Clara Spiel's Holt Green are is still a matter of debate, but there can be little doubt that there was a fixed desire to appoint a woman as fighter pilot on ideological grounds in the interest of diversity and inclusion. Britain's Royal Air Force is under similar pressure from above to ensure that black people are allowed into the service without the tiresome necessity of passing some tricky aptitude tests. The story of Clara Spills Holt Green I thought was worth thinking of because it shows the perils of pressing too hard for strict parity of gender and ethnicity in an enterprise like an air force. We have in recent years seen very similar forces at work in this country's Royal Air Force. For the better part of 6 months in 2020, attempts were made by means of freedom of information requests to persuade Britain's Royal Air Force to disclose the ethnicity of those who did well in the aptitude tests taken by those applying for admission, and also to reveal which groups had not done so well. When in December that year the figures were finally released, it was very plain why there had been such a marked reluctance to let people see them. The tests themselves concerned things like spatial awareness, the ability to manipulate three-dimensional objects mentally, rotating them and working out where they would fit and so on. They had no connection at all with formal education and were not culturally biased. The scores in one, the BIS test of spatial ability, taken by those who might wish to be gunners, police officers and lorry drivers, were fairly typical. Over 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, the results were as follows. Applicants from any Chinese background, 60.1. White British applicants, 55.4. Asian Indian applicants, 50.1. Mixed Black Caribbean and White, 51.4. Black Caribbean, 44. Black African, 40.6. These scores align very closely with other tests, such as those for IQ, the Scholastic Aptitude Test used for admission to American universities, and many others. Chinese people, as usual, came above everybody else. This will come as little or no surprise. Below the Chinese came white applicants, and a little way below them were those whose families were from the Indian subcontinent. Looking at the scores for black people, though, showed something starkly, which is that the more black heritage a candidate had, the lower the score he achieved in the test. Candidates of mixed black Caribbean background, usually one black parent and one white, came higher than black Caribbeans, who usually have some white ancestry. The lowest scores of all were by those whose background was entirely black African. It need hardly be said that the Royal Air Force, from whom these scores had to be prized as though from a closely shut-up oyster, was quick to respond with an orthodox explanation. A spokesman blamed underlying inequality in education. This is, however, hardly convincing. Had the different black groups all received a different quality or standard of education from each other? Did the young people of black African heritage go to schools inferior to those which the Caribbeans had attended? It must be borne in mind that all these groups had by and large grown up and been educated in Britain. Did the Chinese and white people all attend better schools? This argument would also have been more persuasive if the tests had entailed a knowledge of mathematics, English grammar, or general knowledge. They did not. All they required was an ability to think clearly and logically. Any notion the tests could have been culturally biased in favour of Chinese and white people may also be abandoned. This might have been a reasonable point if one ethnic group consisted of illiterate Kalahari bushmen and another of middle-class citizens from a sophisticated city like New York, but all came from the same country. Any rational person who has not been indoctrinated into contemporary ways of thought and examined the raw data from the RAF aptitude tests without the filter of modern ideology and correctness of outlook would most probably assume that the Chinese were the brightest and most able, and the black Africans the dullest in terms of thinking skills. But most of us veer away from this simple view of the matter in favour of mysterious underlying inequalities in education, and indeed view the obvious answer to the conundrum as being disgusting and unacceptable, tells us a great deal about the mores of the modern Western world in the first decades of the 21st century. But nothing at all about why black people do not do well in objective tests of aptitude and intelligence. It later emerged that the RAF had actually been ignoring the results of the aptitude tests and deliberately selecting black candidates with lower scores and offering them posts over and above white ones who scored more highly. Since some of the positions were as gunners, one can only imagine the scope for mishap when an RAF gunner is lacking in the ability to visualize three-dimensional relationships of targets during combat. In the description to this video, I give a couple of references which interested viewers may care to follow up, which support and give some credence to what I've been saying here.